Amen. I know for some of us, the subject of parable teaching seems not a waste of time. Maybe that's too strong a statement, but people can't see the relevance of it, and they want to go to, I don't know, more pertinent subjects, more relevant subjects, things that are more interesting or exciting or meeting or whatever, however you want to describe it. So I apologise to those people. But I really do think, as I travel across various parts of the world, and I meet so many people who, some of them are, you could argue, are frontline teachers, and some of them are relatively new. There are so many people who are either not understanding how to approach Scripture, or when they do that and they begin to make applications, they come up with many lines of what appear to be evidence, but on closer scrutiny you see that they're actually floundering and they're not really saying much. It's just a lot of noise, a lot of words. And I think, in my estimation at least, it's because they're not really applying these rules correctly. So I want to give an example of what I consider a trap that we as a movement have fallen into, a problem that we're only, I think, now realising. Perhaps some of us are, perhaps some of us aren't. And I'm suggesting this is indicative of the lack of appreciation of not using or sticking to rules that we should become accustomed to. Now, for a long time, 18 months is a long time nowadays, maybe a little bit longer, you'll have heard, I've left this on the board, I'm not using it, I just didn't erase everything there. The phrase PBM. Even if you're relatively new, I think all of you have heard the term and we know what it stands for, even though we may not fully appreciate the implications of what it actually means. It stands for, of course, prediction before midnight. So this phrase, as I say, was developed well over 12 months ago now, and it came from Africa, and it kind of has morphed from its humble beginnings into something that doesn't resemble what the initial thoughts and ideas were.
What is morphed?
Changed, grown into something that's different. Like a caterpillar morphs into a butterfly. When you look at the two, you would never imagine that a butterfly came from this insect. They don't have any resemblance. Like a baby human being does not morph into an adult. They look identical.
Like Christian, non-Christian.
Yeah. So, without getting into the intricacies of what all of this means, when this idea of prediction before midnight was first considered, it actually meant something different to how most people are using it today. Because most people are using the prediction before midnight to talk about the prediction of midnight, not the prediction before midnight. Because if you think about it, it's an oxymoron to say prediction before midnight, because prediction and before are really synonyms. Because obviously it wouldn't be a prediction after midnight, because then it wouldn't be a prediction, it would just be a statement that something's happened. So the whole wording itself has changed from its original intent. So this concept of prediction before midnight was, let me phrase it this way, let me do it this way. If you go to the Millerite line, this is October 22nd, 1844. The only point that I want to bring out in this little discussion is to try to inspire us to be serious about how we approach our study of the Word. Because, you know, if I'm not jumping around and making applications and saying October 22nd is here and we can add dates or numbers or do all of these things that look exciting and look like some great light that's coming out, it can appear like a simple study of Isaiah 28, which all of us are familiar with, and I'm trying to say I think we've approached some of those things incorrectly. It can look boring, especially when almost all of us, if not all of us, are counting the clock now, because we're 11 months and counting, and we're thinking, well, what's all this got to do with the close of probation? But I do want to remind us that what we consider to be the close of probation, because close of probation means the end of something, the end of probationary time or the end of testing time, actually in many ways, in fact in more ways than we might consider, is the beginning of a work. It's not the end of a work. All we've done, if you want to think about what PBM really means to a priest, it means the end of your training. Now you actually begin to do some work. And if you've watched Sister Tessie's presentations, you'll know that she makes that analogy when she considers the life of Christ. She takes his life in two steps, 12 years and 18 years. By the time he reaches the age of 30, he's going to begin to do a work. And those, particularly the 18 years before, have basically been a training for him. So when we think about close of probation, it's not the end of something, it really is the beginning of something. So if we're not getting our house in order now, in understanding how to approach the scriptures, and at least all of us are doing it in the same way, so you don't teach it in one way and my brother over here doesn't teach it in another way. We've all got our own way of explaining things for sure, but we should all be saying the same thing in the same way, because we now have a work to do for the Levites. I think we're all aware of that, that the work for the Levites hasn't really begun. There's things we still don't understand about how we interact with them. There's a lot of darkness about what happens after 2019, especially as we interact with them, how we go about doing that, because we all realise now, in 2018, pretty much the doors are closed to the churches, except in a few pockets around the world. In a few places where the conference structure is not clued up about who we are and what we're doing, we can sort of slip under the radar and do something, but it doesn't take long for them to get clued up about who we are. So we know we have to do work for the Levites, but we're not really sure about how we're supposed to do that. The point I want to make is, if we're not trained, if we're not ready to be able to teach them effectively, we're derelict in our duty. So to me, it's extremely important in the remaining moments that we have in probationary time to make sure that we're actually studying the Bible together in a right and appropriate way. So I've just given an example of how I think we as a movement, I guess it's always dangerous to say, as a movement, maybe it's individuals in the movement, have made some wrong steps just on this one specific issue about PBM. So the first thing I want to point out, when we talk about PBM, we've changed what that original intent was. The phrase itself does not make any sense to say prediction before midnight. That would be like saying before midnight, or prediction midnight, because prediction and before are synonyms. If we're going to use a phrase like this to do some predictive work, I'm saying it should be prediction of midnight. Now you might think this is all about semantics. I'm not convinced that it is. I think we live and die by the words that we speak and the words that we understand. If you start teaching people or saying things in an incorrect fashion, those words get lodged in people's brains and they produce chemical reactions, in fact, and they send you down a direction which may or may not be correct. So we have to be really careful about the selection of our words. I think all of us are aware of that. So if you go to the Millerite history and we start talking about prediction before midnight, you all know that October 22nd is not midnight. So just want to make that clear. We all know that's not correct. If you go to Matthew 25 and we went to April the 19th, where the Millerites tarried, and I spoke about that, I think yesterday or maybe the day before. No, I think it was yesterday, when we spoke about the parables of the 10 virgins and how we could apply it in various dispensations. So there's a tarrying time here, and we all know that midnight happens in between these two events. And in fact, it's not just in between these two events. The word often we use is a chiastic structure, but Ellen White will describe it that this event is midway. So we could have midnight and midway. In fact, the Millerites are going to use this midway concept to actually define and target what midnight is. And they're going to identify that this is July the 21st. This is the meeting on a Sunday evening in the Boston Tabernacle that Samuel Snow delivers. He's ridden 40 miles on horseback that day. I know we make a great emphasis on the horseback that he rides at Exeter, but he's ridden on a horse here also at Boston. It's a 40-mile ride that he's going to do. And this is midway. I think all of us should be vaguely familiar with that. If you're not, it's not pertinent to what I want to say. So when we take this concept of PBM, what are we referring to? Where do we even get this phrase or this concept or this idea from? It was certainly from the Millerite history. We didn't invent this. I'm not saying we didn't invent the term, we did, but we got this phrase with the symbols that's attached to it, a prediction and the phrase or the word midnight, and it was created from a Millerite storyline. So you've heard Elder Jeff mention a number of dates, and one of them is May 2nd. Now this is not an exercise in Millerite history. I'm not really dealing with all the events that are going on, but what I want us to see is that when we talk about prediction before midnight, what the Millerites are going to be doing is here in April, they have lost the message of time. There is no time in the Millerite history in April. Does everybody understand what I would mean by that? Do you understand, Sister Sophie, what I mean by that? Mr. Pascal? No? So, you know back here, from 1798 to 1840, the Millerites are looking forward and they're predicting the Second Advent. And what is their target waymark, or their target date? It's this one here.
Yes.
You agree with that? This is 1843. This is the 19th of April, 1844, which is the first day of the first month, New Year's Day. But they're saying Christ is going to come in 1843, which would be just the year before. In the language that we're using, the latest it could happen would be April the 18th. Yeah? So when that date comes and goes, now they have no direction, they have no time. So now they're waiting. Okay. We put tarrying time, by the way, and often we say that the virgins were tarrying. I don't know if you think that way, but the virgins are not tarrying. It's the bridegroom that's tarrying, not the virgins. And tarrying means tardy, or lazy, or slow. So they've got to this day, and the way the story would read in Matthew 25, it's the bridegroom that's late. He's tardy, he's late. Now we know that that's not really correct when you see Ellen White's commentary on that history, and when you go to Habakkuk chapter 2 and Ezekiel chapter 12, because in those passages it says, though it tarry, or it appears to tarry, it doesn't really tarry. It shall happen when it shall speak when it's supposed to speak. So what you see in those passages is an inference to a mistake or a misunderstanding. And it takes them a little bit of time as a collective group of people to work out what's going on. You remember I said as a movement, you know, we say something or we don't say something. I want to be careful about what we represent the movement to be. Because if you go to this Millerite line, what is the movement? Is the movement William Miller, who is chastising Samuel Snow and telling him he's a heretic, telling him he's teaching error? Is he a symbol or a representation of the movement, or is Samuel Snow in that history? The reason why I ask that is because sometimes we focus on numbers, like it's the quantity of people that define what a movement is, and it couldn't be an individual singular voice. So I'm suggesting in this history, when you get to, you could argue pre-April, but certainly post-April, that the movement is being symbolised by the work of Samuel Snow and Storrs. I can't remember his first, George Storrs. They're really what the movement is. If we want to ask what is the movement doing, they're the people that we should be focusing on, their messages, not the message that William Miller is giving, in reality not giving, or someone like Bates, who has a, you know, when we're in August, has a boring sermon that no one's interested in. And not only is they're not interested in, he's actually teaching error, is he not? Do we agree with that? That Bates is teaching error in August. What do you think about that, Brother Rayon? What's Bates saying at the August camp meeting?
Don't remember off the top of my head.
Anybody? Brother Magic?
Vegetarian.
No. He's more than that. It's a lot more pointed.
We're on the direction.
He says we're like a boat in a sea, and we don't know where we're going. He said that's the because he's using his captain heritage, and that's not true. That is not true. The movement already knows the direction in which it's going by the time you get to August. In fact, I don't know how many people were at Boston, but that tabernacle can hold, I think, it's well over 1,000. I think it might be up to 2,000 people. I don't know if anybody knows that number. 3,000.
I think it was 2,000 people.
Yeah, it's a huge facility, purpose-built by the Millerites. It's their facility. So I don't know how full that was, that meeting, but there were hundreds, I would suggest, people who heard that message and caught the inspiration of the hour. So the movement is already aware of what's going on, and here Bates is, it's the third meeting that Snow is doing. He's already done Boston, he's already done Concord, now it comes to Exeter, and I'm not disparaging Bates in any way. This is nothing to do with individual people, but what I want us to see is that when we start thinking about who the movement is in this history, it's certainly not Miller or Bates, because Bates is saying, we don't know what's happening, we're still hanging around waiting for something, and the message has already been delivered, so he's not actually teaching the truth. I want us to see that. So, coming back to my point, at midnight, Samuel Snow is going to deliver a message at Boston that is going to take people from this point and bring them to October 22nd. He's going to do the same thing a few weeks later in August the 14th to the 15th. So he does the same thing again. And both of those messages are pointing to October 22nd, which is not midnight. In fact, the messages are given at midnight. So here, their target is this date here. Perhaps I should have done it this way. Then they have no direction of time, and then at midnight they're going to go to the correct day. So I want us to see that. I've got the I here in 1798, but I want to make the point that really that direction, I'll put a star here, happens in 1840. So I want to do that. So they know where they're going at the beginning in some kind of approximate way. I've put 1798. In reality, it's 1818, 1816. When we think of Miller. By 1840, they're doing exactly the same thing, but now they're a lot more confident of what they're doing. So I've taken these two dates, July and August, and I've separated them because they're obviously separated by a time period. But if you go to Matthew 25, what you find is in verse 6 that these are actually a singular point. It doesn't distinguish between the two dates, July and August. So this is what we would call the midnight cry. In fact, the Millerites identified July 21st as the midnight cry. They're adamant about that, and I haven't found, some strong argument or some statement to say when you get to August that they call that the midnight cry. What happens at August after the camp meeting, the cry of midnight starts spreading in a way that it didn't do in July. So there are some differences between the two. When we approach the subject, spreading in a way that it didn't do it seemed fairly contained in Boston. And when you get to Concord, at Concord, there's not even a record of what happens. All we know is there's an obscure statement that says he delivered the midnight cry message at Concord, and then you get to Exeter. So,
can you remind me the date of Concord?
1st of August. And Exeter is the 12th of August. So there is this history, but I'm just going to make that singular point for the purpose of this discussion. So at midnight, what are they doing? They're predicting the close of probation. We know this is the close of probation, but they're not even going to call it the close of probation. They're going to call it what? The second advent. So the Millerite history, at midnight, they're predicting the second advent. We might call it the close of probation. They're not fully sure about, at least Miller isn't fully sure about exactly even what date they should be targeting. He's not sure if it should be the 10th day of the 7th month or the 15th day of the 7th month. He's still open only a few days before to ascertain what's going on. So, coming to May, we know that Samuel Snow writes an article. Elder Jeff put it on that boardwork here yesterday, all of those articles that were given. What we do know is that this paper or article is before midnight. And here at May 2nd, what is Samuel Snow doing? What's the purpose of that article? It's to predict what? It's to predict this event here. It's not to predict midnight. We're okay with that? It's not to predict midnight. So when this phrase was first originally considered or brought to view, or invented, depending on how you want to do it, when it says prediction before midnight, what the brethren were doing was, they were looking at May 2nd, and May 2nd is when? Before midnight. So they're saying there's a prediction of the close of probation or the second advent, even before midnight. That's what that whole phrase was about. And that phrase has now changed, as I say, into a prediction of midnight. And we've turned the close of probation into midnight because we have reasons for doing that. So,
can you repeat what you said? The brother, what they said on May. Can you repeat your thought?
I thought you were going to do it then.
No. You said the brother, they
Okay, so May 2nd,
ouais.
it was this May 2nd article or paper that created this concept of a prediction before midnight. So May is before July, and in May, Samuel Snow is predicting the second advent. I'm going to call it the close of probation. That's what he's predicting. He's predicting it even before midnight. That's what it started off meaning. And I'm saying it has changed its meaning. So, not discussing how we've done this or why. If this is the close of probation, this is raffia. We're describing this close of probation or raffia as being midnight. And so, if this was 9/11, 2014, 2018, what we've been discussing in the movement for some time now is when we use this phrase PBM, we've said sometime after 2014 there's going to be an event that happens which we want to call PBM, and that PBM is going to be doing what? It's going to be predicting this event here. So we've changed its original meaning to mean the prediction before midnight. Again, the phrase itself I don't think is grammatically accurate, because it should be the prediction of midnight, because that event is midnight. That's how we're actually using that phrase, even though we actually say the words PBM. So just coming back to here, this is the history of my understanding of how this term was created or invented. And it was all tagged to this May 2nd article, and what they're doing, whether it's May or July or August, the focus is always the same. It's always October 22nd. There is no prediction of May, there is no prediction of July, no prediction of August. They're not predicting those things. They just hit those days, and when they come to those dates, they're predicting something in the future. So when we come to our own history, what we have done, and I think it's because we've not followed these rules properly, we've come to a place, and I'm not saying we're doing it now, but I just want to give an example of how I think we've got into a mess. There were, I don't know what to call it, people in our movement, I don't know what to do, I'll just say, there were brethren, sisters, there were people in our movement who were doing this. They were doing studies so that they would get to a place where they would look for characteristics. So these are the characteristics, not of midnight, not of raffia, although there are characteristics of raffia. They were looking for characteristics of PBM. And the reason they're looking for characteristics of PBM is because, if I just change this scale a bit, here's 2014, and we're here, and here maybe is the last couple of years, 2016, 17. And what we've been doing is, our focus, our target, has been this event here. So what we've been aiming to do is to predict the events that surround PBM. Whether or not people were going to predict a date for that, or they were going to predict the event. So when those events had happened, we'd say, now we know we're at PBM. And not only were we doing that, we were also predicting the events that are associated with raffia. So we're now predicting two separate waymarks before they're occurring. If you can hold on to those thoughts. And the question that I would pose to us is, where did we get this methodology from? this concept or this idea of predicting two things that are headed before us, when one of them, by definition, prediction before midnight, which was taken from this story here, what was that? It was when you get to May 2nd, when you get to event, what will you be doing? When you get to this date, what will you be doing? Predicting what? You'll be predicting this. So what we ended up doing in our movement is saying what we want to do is to predict this event here, PBM. And my question I would pose to you is, why were we doing that? When we get to PBM, what have we achieved? What is the purpose of predicting? Here we'll say, turn on the news, and you'll know, based upon what's happening in the world, or what's happening in our movement, internal or external, that we are at PBM. Once we do that, what have we achieved? Because what we're doing, independent of that study, is also predicting this. But if you see how all of this modelling is happening today, what you'll find, it's not matching how the Millerites had done their modelling. And if we're going to do line upon line, at least one suggestion I would make is that we should still be following the same pattern. The point I want to make is, when they hit these dates, they're not standing here and say, let's predict May 2nd. Then when we get to May 2nd, we'll predict the second advent or the close of probation. But that's what we have tended to do. We're here and saying, let's predict this, because when we predict this, then we know that we're nearly here. We're doing a two-step prediction before close of probation. I recognise this is the second advent, but I'm saying second advent, close of probation. I think you can make that argument. The Millerites do make that argument that they coalesce those two events into a very close time span. So I'm making them a singular point. They don't do this two-step predicting work. It's only a singular prediction that they're making. So we got into, maybe this is a strong, bold statement, we got into a mess because of the methodology that we thought was good in trying to delve into the characteristics of PBM. And then so let me stop there. When we start coming back into the Millerite history, as I say, when we start talking about PBM and the prediction before midnight, what we're really doing is we're focusing our attention here at the close of probation, second advent. And that work was done in earnest here at midnight. And not only midnight, but the midnight cry. So what I'm saying is, when we talk about PBM, what are we expecting to happen at PBM? I
assumed that people were pushing that because that's what they thought was going to wake up the Levites.
So they did. That's what people were thinking, that it's going to wake up the Levites. And again, to me, that's another misconception of how our lines have been constructed. The waking up of the Levites, depending on what we mean by waking up, because...
But the prediction, like in 1840, when it brought in an impetus...
Yes. So
okay,
when we think about it in that context, that could never have been. Because we've conflated our lines together.
Yes.
And what this history is actually the history purely and solely for the priests. And if we're waking anybody up from the conference structure from the churches, it would be priests who have only got a few remaining moments of probationary time to get their act together and to join us. And we read from Zechariah chapter 2 yesterday, verse 6. Is it 2:6? Where it's this last call for the people to come out. Ho, ho, flee from the land of the north. Escape from the daughter of Babylon. So I think that's a separate and distinct misconception that we've had. And and again brought about by not being careful or attentive to how the method or the rules that we're supposed to be using work. So just coming back to this point, the way we began to morph this phrase PBM, the prediction of midnight, and as Sister Kathy said, this was the last call to the Levite, and the reason she says that is because we morphed this into the cry of midnight, or the midnight cry. We don't call it the midnight cry, we call it the loud cry. So we were thinking that PBM would be a loud cry, and I'm saying that it is. It is the loud cry. It's what we might call here in this history, August. Once again, I'm saying that the people are not predicting when that event happens. So, what we've found ourselves as a movement now is we've been kind of caught short because people have been waiting and expecting for these events to happen at PBM, and when that happens, then we'd say, now let's start crying that close of probation is about to happen. And that wouldn't happen until those characteristics have occurred. So first we have to predict when these things happen, and once they happen, then we're in a position to make a call or a prediction that this is going to happen. So you've got this two-step prediction built into the model that we've created in our movement. And I'm saying it wasn't created here in the Millerite history. And the reason why this has caused many people consternation now is because the message that Sister Tess has brought to the movement I think has been widely recognised, either of people that have willingly accepted it or they've been forced to agree to the logic of it, but people are acknowledging that this is the midnight cry. This is the midnight cry message, and as per the Millerite model, if this was 2018, the midnight cry message, regardless of whether it's 2018, if it's the midnight cry message, what would you expect it to be doing? You'd expect it to be giving a cry that says what? Probation's about to close. And what has caught us off guard, caught many people off guard, is that no one was expecting it. There was no prediction that this was going to happen. No one was saying 6 months ago, 12 months ago, a few months ago. This year, according to some characteristics that we can interrogate from previous histories, we know that the midnight cry is going to be given in the autumn of 2018. Because that's the direction which many people who were studying were going down. They were looking for characteristics of PBM so that they could know when they're in PBM. And what it's caused people to do is to go back to their studies and to reevaluate all of their logic that they used to develop all of these arguments. Because essentially, they've just been pushed to one side. Now, I'm not saying that there's not some merit in some of that work that was being done, some of those studies that had been presented even perhaps. But what I am saying is, it seems to me that we now have evidence that the methodology that those brethren were using to develop this model has been demonstrated not to be correct. Because if it was correct, we could now say, of course, all these things have happened in the fall of 2018 and we're here. So people are now going to the place because they still want to hold on to these concepts to say, well, what we're now seeing is that this is just the beginning of the loud cry, and maybe these events that we're expecting are going to still be future. Now, it's not my intent to disparage anybody's studies, but it's my intent to encourage each and every one of us to be extremely careful of how we're approaching our studies. And things that look interesting or exciting or seem to have some semblance of fitting, I'm asking us to question, based upon sound principles that we've been employing and using in our movement for a long time now. And we've got to a place that we're actually beginning to try to formalise.
Okay, then I have a question. We're going in order, just on the line you're drawing. Why are we not putting Sunday law and then close of probation? Because isn't the next step after the midnight cry the Sunday law, the real Sunday law? I mean, why do we use the close of probation? I realize that's going to close the probation of Levites and priests, but why aren't we putting it in the order it's going to come in?
So, we've done some tricky things in our movement. The way we play with words and the language that we use. Now, some of that is our own doing, but a lot of that is based upon usage that we borrow from the spirit of prophecy. So, Ellen White is essentially going to invent a term. Invent is not a really accurate way of expressing it, called the loud cry. And the reason I say invented, because you can go to various portions of scripture where angels cried with a loud voice. You see that relatively often, and we say, well, that voice with a loud cry is the loud cry. So that's why I want to be careful when I say invented. But she makes this term up, loud cry, and what she does is she makes it synonymous with the midnight cry. So she's done that. She's created a term called the loud cry, and she's made that essentially equal to the midnight cry. And the midnight cry, which is used from the Millerite history, was a phrase that's borrowed from Matthew 25. So you get Matthew 25, a cry at midnight. It's not only in Matthew 25, you can find it in other places, in Exodus for instance. At Passover there was a cry at midnight, a different cry perhaps, but this midnight cry then gets morphed into a loud cry. And what Ellen White wants to do is to try to parallel histories. So what she's going to end up doing, if you go to Great Controversy chapter 38, and particularly if you went to Early Writings, page 277, hasn't got a chapter number, the chapter title is called The Loud Cry itself. She's going to take Millerite phraseology in history and she's going to make it equivalent to what we call the loud cry. So what we've done in our movement is let me try and draw it the way Ellen White would explain it to us. Here's the second Advent. Here's the close of probation. This is Daniel 12:1. Here's the Sunday law, and this Sunday law is 1141. That Sunday law that we could call it the National Sunday Law, the USA. And she's not going to give you 9/11. 9/11 you have to tease out and develop, and she's not going to give you 1989. Again, this one you have to tease out. This one's relatively more straightforward, I think, because it's locked into a verse, Daniel 11 verse 40. So, when Ellen White talks about the midnight cry being fulfilled at the end of the world, and she's going to change the phrase to the loud cry, she places it squarely here. So when we talk about the midnight cry, often we use it synonymously with the loud cry, like that. What we have noticed, and I think I mentioned it yesterday, and Elder Jeff alluded to it, I think on the first day that we were here, maybe the second, that we've been using fractals, we've even been using time setting way before we were conscious of it. So I'm saying when we started approaching 9/11, 9/11 is not a waymark that is a fractal waymark. And what I mean by that is these are fundamental waymarks in a reform line. There are other waymarks, such as some here, that are not part of this structure, but I would call them important waymarks, but they're at a fractal level. I don't want to use the word typology because it's not type, but they have characteristics that are very similar to the characteristics here you find at the end in this line of history. But 9/11 doesn't possess those characteristics. 9/11 is a waymark in this line. So to kind of make that clear, it's easy if you put an agricultural cycle that I think most of us are familiar with now, that we would call this the ploughing, and Ellen White will tell us that this is the latter rain and that this is the this is harvest. So just by inference, you know that this is the former rain. So everything that we're studying, and to put it succinctly, this is Daniel 11 verse 41. Basically everything we've been doing for the last 4 years is essentially all Daniel 11 verse 40. All not even the last 4 years, in fact for most of the last 29 years, we've spoken very little about this history, very little about the details of all that's going on post-Sunday law. So, you know, the 5,000 plus hours of material, video material that we have, is almost all exclusively about Daniel 11 verse 40. That verse is so important, I'm arguing that we've spent 5,000 hours discussing it, an inordinate amount of time just looking at one Bible verse. Because the more you look at it, the more it just opens up and expands into almost like this black hole that hasn't got a bottom. The more you dig, the deeper you get, and it never ends. So all of the waymarks that we're talking about are all in here. So what we've done, or what we've understood now, in a much clearer fashion than we've ever understood before, is how did you get from 1989 or 9/11, we'll begin here, how did you get from 9/11 to the Sunday law? And Ellen White is essentially blank on that information. She doesn't tell you how you navigate from this waymark to this one. And our task as a movement, I'm suggesting, I don't say our sole purpose, but at the moment our sole purpose is to instruct people how you get from point A to point B. That's all we've been doing for the last, since we've been in existence, I think, and we're still going to be doing that for a lot longer. So what we've found is that I could say we're going to go through 4 steps. Now, it would be easy if we go through 4 steps, because we say we'll just walk through 4 steps and we'll get to the Sunday law. But it's not that straightforward. What do those steps look like? What characteristics do they have? How would you find those steps? Because they're not readily available in the Spirit of Prophecy or in the Bible. You have to construct them. And you don't construct them through logic, although that's what we're accused of doing. You construct them through methodology. And so we have to have a method to be able to create these waymarks. So what will that method be? I'm saying the method that we're using is repeating patterns. When we start grappling with repeating patterns, it then gives us the tools to say, first of all, there's going to be this waymark here, and what will it look like? So if we were just to brainstorm, I don't think we'd have any idea. We'd just say, well, before the Sunday law, there's going to be natural disasters. Ellen White gives us that kind of information. There's going to be an economic collapse, and the people are going to ask for a Sunday law to be put in place. We all know that. But to me, that is not enough information that's given in a succinct and clear fashion to be of much use to us. It gives us a rough approximation of what things are going to look like, but it's not in enough detail that I think we need to know. When you're back here, or back here, you know, in the 18th or 19th century, it would be enough to know that just before the Sunday law, things are going to start getting bad. That's why we're going to have a Sunday law. But we're getting so close, we want to know some details. What is it going to look like? How is it going to operate? Who are going to be the players? What are the false alarms and what are the true alarms? How do we develop that logic, that understanding? Human beings, science has demonstrated that we're programmed to identify patterns. We're experts at it. The way our eyes function is they automatically zoom in onto patterns. That's why, if you see a cloud, that's why it's so easy to find patterns in clouds and find shapes, because we're designed to do that. And it's this concept of patterns, or what we're calling fractals, that is the key to unlocking how you develop those waymarks, those events. Now that would be straightforward enough, but there's a twist in this, because if you're going to use patterns to say this event and this one, say for example 2014, if we went to 2014, to create 2014, first of all you have to do it through a pattern or through a fractal. And you say, okay, we've got a fractal pattern and now we can generate the year 2014. You think that's good. But the problem with that is that 2014 was created via a pattern. And what pattern are you using? It's this pattern here, this pattern that Ellen White has already given to us. She didn't give us these two, I understand that, but she gave us all of this. So once we've got this original, and we're going to create these waymarks through patterns, fractals, then the problem that we're faced with is that 2014, which was created via a pattern, has to have characteristics of the original pattern. So 2014 then takes on the nature or the characteristics of the National Sunday Law, if I can explain it that way. It's not the National Sunday Law, it's not Daniel 11:41, because we're still stuck in verse 40, but it picks up characteristics of that. So we've got two things to deal with. First of all, 2014 is just one step. It's nothing more than that, it's just a stepping stone to bring you to the National Sunday Law, which is the real deal. But when you get to 2014, it's going to possess characteristics of that Sunday Law in some shape or form. It won't have all the characteristics, but it will have some. And those characteristics themselves will be the means by which we actually created 2014. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Can you give an example of characteristic?
The simplest one is if you use an agricultural model. Okay, no, a simple one is we're going to have an outpouring of information, of light. If we say that the latter rain is an outpouring of information of the Holy Spirit, you should expect to see that in 2014. We do. If you go back to this line here, we know another characteristic of the Sunday Law. Brethren, when they see the close of probation about to come, they get scared. They get concerned about what's going to happen, and they feel like their temporal prosperity is about to come to an end. Or they dread physical pain. They've got some fear that's created in them about because of what's about to happen. So what they do is they leave the ranks of God's army. So they walk away from the movement, from God's church. And so we'd expect to see some characteristics like that, and we do. So they're two characteristics, an outpouring of information and a separation based upon people anticipating that something's about to happen. So they're two characteristics. So once we start creating these waymarks, we're required to locate them so that we know that we're getting closer. These are the steady trends of, or the steady steps that of an approaching God. And I might use a phrase similar to that, paraphrase. So we've got waymarks that we need, and we need to have a methodology for creating the waymarks. I'm saying that's patterns, fractals. And so as soon as you do that, you get into a problem, because 2014 is not some benign waymark. It has to possess characteristics from its original pattern. And so coming back to Sister Kathy's question is, how comes we're getting the midnight cry or the loud cry out of sync. It's not being synchronized in a way that we should expect. And the reason for that is, when we talk about the line that I spoke about a minute ago, this was raffia, which we call midnight at one level, and I'm saying this is the close of probation, and then we have the midnight cry, and then we have 2014. The problem is, this structure doesn't seem to be in sequence, it seems to be out of sequence. And the reason it seems to be out of sequence is because all of this is happening here. It's these three ray marks here. I'll put COP like that. So all these are just stepping stones to bring us to the Sunday law. But to create them, we had to have done something clever. Because Ellen White doesn't give us the information. She says, something's going to happen in 2014. You're going to have this great flood of light, Ezra 7. And when that happens, you'll know that you're close to the Sunday law. It wasn't given like that. We had to create those lines out of thin air, basically. And how did we do that? I say thin air, that's obviously not true. I don't want people to misunderstand that we're just inventing things. We find them in the scriptures. And what we're using is this fractal methodology. And so what we did is, to create this line, we say it has all the characteristics, or many of the characteristics of the National Sunday Law. And then, this loud cry here has the characteristics here. So this would be midnight cry, and I'm saying this is 2018. And this has the characteristics of the loud cry. And in the code of probation, which is 2019, has the characteristics of Daniel 12:1. So what we're doing is we're walking through a history that we're calling the loud cry, and the loud cry is before the Sunday law, so it's all coming out of sync. In the past, we've not been fully attuned to what we're doing, even though God was directing us in these things. So people would argue that we're getting things out of synchronization, like we've got the latter rain before the Sunday law, before Ellen White would tell us the latter rain exists. She tells us clearly latter rain is here, but we've been placing the latter rain beforehand. How could we do that? And I'm saying we weren't fully attuned to what God was showing us until very recently being the last 4 years. We've had this flood of light. We've actually come to a self-awareness of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I'll give you an opportunity to re-ask another question on the same one. Is what we're doing is, when we talk about this history and it all seems to be out of sync, it really isn't, because 2014 is a Sunday law. This is the loud cry, and this is the close of probation. The sequence of events is exactly the sequence of events we have here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But these sequences are brought to view here before the National Sunday Law, and at simple level, they're just stepping stones to bring us to the Sunday Law, so that we know we're getting closer. But they're not that benign, they're not just steps. These steps are potent steps, because if you flounder on one of these steps, you can't move forward. And we get to a stage that by the time you get to 2019, November the 9th, if you flounder at that step, there's no opportunity of recovery after that. It's a permanent mistake. In this history, we could argue that if you were deceived by someone from 2014 onwards, someone tricked you and said, those people over there, that ministry, FFA, are bad people, don't listen to them, and they give you some evidence, they call themselves Melchizedek, you say, that's crazy. That's Gadol in its most extreme. Now we've got the evidence on them. They must be bad people. When you get deceived like that, you've got an opportunity to come out of that deception. You can go to those people and explain the methodology, and they say, that makes sense, I get it. You have an opportunity to get off the platform and to get back on again. I think sometimes this concept of getting on and off of the platform is abused. I think the people who get off and get back on again, I think they're the ones who are deceived in getting off. Someone says you're on a shaky platform and they say, is it really bad? Let me get off and have a look. And when they look, they get back on. The people who get off deliberately because they want to get on that platform and they want to shake it, and they jump off and they never get back on again. But there are a few people who do. I'm saying by the time you get to 2019, you can't get on and off anymore. It becomes a permanent thing. But if you just think about steps, you wouldn't get that inference. You'd just say, you haven't even got to the Sunday law, and the Sunday law is the test. It's verse 41. Many will be overthrown. There's no overthrowing that's brought to view in verse 40. It's all benign. But now we're seeing that those steps are not as benign as we might think. And the reason we know that is because the way they were created, what they represent is this fractal of this bigger line here, or the original line. That's how they were created. So when you get to 2019, it will possess characteristics that you see here in Daniel 12:1. At one level. At another level, it's just a step that Ellen White doesn't even talk about, and we're saying is the most important step for us, and Ellen White doesn't even mention it. So how can it be so important if she never even talks about it? It becomes important because the methodology creates that importance. And this is the perennial problem that we have, because people are saying, show me a passage, show me a quote, that you're saying that before the Sunday law there's going to be a close of probation, and there is no quote. And then we get trapped into this, or put into this corner to say, the lines trump inspiration. We get trapped into that kind of spiraling logic. And I'm saying that is a false representation of what we're doing. What we're doing is using a methodology that's well defined, explainable, that I think is the way we should be approaching Scripture. And one of the reasons why I gave the example of compare and contrast, and to show us the examples, it was to show us that we can approach Scripture with missing information, and then we can fill in the information, not through logic or guesswork, but because they're the rules of how we're even supposed to approach the Word of God. And that's exactly what we're doing here. It's not any different. All of this use of fractals was not an invention of ours. We didn't invent it. We got that straight from Revelation 14. Verse 6 and 7, the first angel's message, is a fractal. Now, when we talk about the fractal, fear God, give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come, which says all the three components of the three angels' messages, that's all good and well. If I can just do it this way, we have the first, second and third, 6 and 7, 8 and 9 to 11. Only smart because people don't like me saying 9 to 11 for the third angel. And the first angel looks like this. I think you've all seen studies like that. So, this is the simple approach to an explanation or a demonstration or a proof that fractals are there, they really work. Fractals come in different shapes and sizes. Another way to explain fractals is tessellation, which is repeating patterns. And repeating patterns don't necessarily have this expansive quality to them, like this. They're just repeating patterns. We've all probably seen them, where you get these mosaic blocks in, like tiling, basically. It's the same thing, that's another form of fractals. Again, you see that in the story of Esther, chapter 1. So fractals are sprinkled throughout the Scripture. But when we do this fractal here, and we talk about judgment, we know that the judgment in this 3 here is not the judgment in this 3 here. We know that. Because the judgment here, in the first angel, maybe we don't all know that, I shouldn't assume that we know that, sorry. First angel's message, this judgment here, what is that referring to? What's the target when it says the hour of his judgment has come? What's that referring to, Sister Cedric?
Judging God's people?
Much more specific. Got to be really specific.
judgment of the dead.
Okay, so we can go with the judgment of the dead. Elder Jeff, you said?
October 22nd.
1844, October 22nd. The judgment, I'm going to call it the investigated judgment. We know it's the dead. But when you get to this story here, what is this judgment? What's the target? What's that referring to? Because it's a totally different judgment. It's not the same thing. Right?
Executive?
Executive judgment. So this is the close of probation, if we would go with that. Don't receive the mark of the beast, because you'll be judged if you do, and we'll call that executive judgment. So what this is showing us is that even though you get these repeating patterns, the events possessing similar characteristics are not the same event. You know, they're spread out over a couple of 100 years, maybe not 200, but 100 plus years. They have characteristics, but they're different things. They possess different qualities. So this idea of fractals is an important distinction for us to understand or to really grapple with. And when we do that, again, we can go to the second and go to the first, and we can again see different things, because this number 2 is dealing with what? Fear God, give him glory. So I'm just going to call this is righteous people. And this one is what? Unrighteous people. So this concept of fractals, there's many things we can do with it. It opens up scripture in a way that you wouldn't believe unless you saw it and you participated in it and meditated upon it. So just in these 3 angels' messages, when you just take these verses, it shows you 2 classes of people. It shows you the various steps of the judgment. It shows you time setting. There's so many truths just by looking at, as I say, these few verses. Fractals teach us a lot of information, far more than we'd realise. And what we're doing now is we're handling these truths in such a sophisticated way, sometimes I don't think we realise how, I think I've said this before, I think Elder Jeff mentioned it, how sacred and profound what we're dealing with, and the implications of what it means. At one level, all of this is, we're nowhere near there yet, don't mean in duration because we're relatively close, but in experience. We're only here, and this is just some blank space called the former rain. But look how potent the events are. Look how worried and concerned we all are, rightfully so. Someone else say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, the reason why you don't want to say that that is a type, that 2014 Midnight Cry Consecration, is because it's real for the priest. So what I'm seeing with the 3 is that there's 3 groups, and we're required to see those 3 groups at the end of the world, and that's what the fractals have opened up. You know, it's priests, Levites, Nethinims. I mean, there's 4 groups with 144,000, but on one level there's 3 groups we're required to see, and it's a progressive close of probation. So that is it's not a type, because it's a real antitype for the priest. It's real close of probation for the priest, whatever that looks like. So that's why you can't say it's a type, and you're saying it's a fractal instead. And I think that's important. It's not that complex. It's just we need to see 3 groups, and we need to see them go through an experience on 3 different times. But they're real experiences because it's all the progressive close. It's a real thing. Sorry. Stress that it's real.
Anyone else got any comments or questions?
This is the line only for the priest, okay?
It's not a complete line. I just picked up 3 waymarks.
So just for the priest. And know that we repeat Millerite history. How can we apply this history in their line? Where are we going to put this history in their line? I mean, until when the priest come in the Millerite history, and when the Levites come in Millerite.
I'm not sure if you can do that in that simplistic fashion, that you're going to identify priests, Levites and Nethinims. I think we haven't explored the Millerite line sufficiently enough. We haven't really paid the attention that it needs to. But I'm not sure if we'd even see those three groups in the same way that we see them in our line, with this staggered effect. I don't think you can even see that in the Millerite history. I don't think it works in that same way. Perhaps it does, unless you obviously got some. Looks like you've got some idea.
I didn't know. That's why I asked, because if we are repeat their history, I think should be three groups also in their history.
I'm not arguing that there aren't three groups. If you want to,
Two at least.
if you want to consider the Protestants, the Millerites, and then they're going to give a message to the world.
No,
You can
it's
see three
Christian
groups there.
Levites and Netanims. Well, the Netanims we know before, after 22 October, all right. Priests and Levites.
Oh, did you?
Well, I agree with a little bit of what I understood Parminder to say, is that I don't think the Millerite history exactly illustrates what you're asking for, but you can take Millerite history and you can show three distinct temple cleansings, and the temple cleansings are governed by the everlasting gospel. So you will see three times that two classes of worshippers are illustrated in the Millerite history. So I think you got a little bit of point of reference there for seeing priests, Levites, and Nethinims in our history, but it's at a very shallow level.
You did help me understand more. I think where my problem was is I was thinking that the line you were drawing was the Millerite line and then applying it, and I was not understanding what line you were applying it with, I think. Sometimes all these lines tend to blend in my mind all together and I can't differentiate. That's why I was asking that. I understand what you wrote.
Okay.
I mean, what you explained, and it was helpful.
Great. So,
Can you remember me why we lined up midnight with Russia and midnight cry with Panion in that order? Because I can't remember why we put midnight before midnight cry.
Repeat the question, please.
So when we put midnight close of probation for Russia and after we put Panion, midnight cry, close of probation for the Levirate. But Levite, I don't understand why we put them in this order. Why midnight come before midnight cry?
Because midnight cry comes before midnight cry.
why midnight comes before midnight cry?
Yes, okay.
Because in that model we've got midnight cry before midnight.
Yeah, there's a,
Yeah.
the
Yes,
whole-
I
there's
think-
You
a
mean
cry
why midnight cry comes before midnight?
Yeah,
I think that's what
Yeah,
you
that's what you mean, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, please.
Sister Schmidt?
Are you answered? Okay. Awesome. So I wanted to come back to May 2nd. So if, where is May 2nd? Yeah. So if we line up May 2nd in our line, so what will be the waymark? Is there any waymark for us, for the priest, for May 2nd?
So, I guess what,
when this argument began, and it was an argument, there's people that left this movement over May 2nd was one of their arguments. The May 2nd was picked as the prediction before midnight, but there was some of us that look at Samuel Snow's 4 publications and we take the number 4 in the context of it being progressive and say that all that's really being illustrated in Samuel Snow's line is the progressive development of the midnight cry message. And we weren't, some of us weren't trying to fix it at May 2nd. But that became a point of contention and it contributed to this idea of prediction before midnight. So I think it was a bad idea to mark that so strongly when there were 3 other waymarks in his history.
So this is I understand your answer like the context of the history of May 2nd. So does it mean that for us, we haven't got the equivalent waymark?
We haven't got what?
The equivalent, or a waymark that corresponding to May 2nd? in our line?
I think we were taking something that was progress, to be understood as progressive, and trying to force it into a singular waymark, and you may still be asking for a singular waymark.
Yeah, because I say, if I see this waymark in the Millerite line, for me, we have to have one in our line. So
Where do you see it?
on the board.
No.
But for us, I don't know where, if there is something for us.
I'm saying when I put May 2nd on the board, I'm teaching it as one step of 4 that represents a progressive development.
So is it 2014?
So
If it's a progressive development.
let me try and address it this way. I don't think it's going to answer your question.
Okay.
You can approach a waymark in past history, and you can bring that and try to fix it as a set date. Or you can take that date and you can use it as a symbol of something. You've got two options. Sometimes you might do both, sometimes you might do one or the other. My understanding of May 2nd in the way that it should or would be used, or the inference that was being made about it, is that it's one of those articles or letters that he writes, and it then becomes a symbol of the PBM, or the prediction before the close of probation. I've rubbed it out there. So it's predicting this event here, October 22nd, 1844. And if you go back into the article itself, it has some characteristics about it that promote it to prominence. It had, there's some information in there which gives it characteristics. So this is an important letter. I'm not saying it's more important than the others, but it has some special characteristics about it. And that's why it got identified, I think, as the article that we're going to sort of target when we talk about this concept of the prediction that October 22nd is going to come. So once you can take that characteristic about it, then you can do different things with it. You can take it out of its natural setting, because you can go back to a biblical date and work that out, and you can start putting it in a different place depending on the point you want to make about that. So it got on this characteristic of PBM, so May 2nd equals PBM, and then you could argue that May 2nd is the loud cry. It took on those properties. So once you do that, then you bring it into our line, then you'd ask, well, what would May 2nd be? It depends who you're asking. Because if you're asking the Millerites, May 2nd or PBM or the loud cry, and the loud cry equals the midnight cry, if you ask a Millerite, what was the midnight cry? They will tell you it's what? July 21. So if you take July 21 and bring it into our history, where would July 21 hit?
Sondelo?
Okay, so this would be July 21. So therefore, you'd say that this was the prediction that close probation is about to happen.
Right.
But if you were going to ask us, what is the midnight cry?
October
2018?
Yeah.
Millerite history.
And Millerite history, for us it's August.
August the 14th.
Yeah.
And August the 14th is what we call the loud cry, which would be here.
Right.
Which would be August the 14th, 15th. So this would be 2018, and this would be 2014. So depending on the point that you want to make, you could argue that the prediction before midnight is either 2014 or 2018. And the argument that you're going to begin to show to make that is something that Elder Jeff, I don't want to put words in his mouth, when you talk about an increase of knowledge, are we going to use a hard waymark, or are we going to use this line of progression?
Okay.
So when you start doing it that way, the prediction before midnight, the prediction that Rafi is about to come, even though you don't know it back in 2014, you're already beginning to make that. And how do we know we're beginning to make the prediction that it's about to close in 2014? Because no one even had that in sight back in 2014. How do you know that's happening?
Because of the flood of the night.
But even that flood of the light is not identifying this event. We don't even know midnight exists back in 2014. That's another year away. I'm arguing it's through the structure. It's through this structure that you have here. Because Ellen White will tell you, at the National Sunday Law, when the angel of Revelation 18 comes down, it comes at the right moment when what's about to happen.
Yes, but in 2014 we didn't know about Sunday law. Only a few persons knows about these remarks.
It doesn't matter how many. That's one of the arguments that I'm bringing forth. It can be one person, and one person can represent what the movement is doing, just like in this history.
No.
I'm not trying to make Snow an individual now. I'm just saying it's not about the number of people who understand something.
Or aware of something.
Well, if you don't understand, you're not going to be aware of it. It's not the quantity of people that understand what's going on that defines
What is the movement?
what the movement understands.
So we can say, so it's progressive or, well, in fact.
So I'm saying no one probably understood that here, the dynamics of it, but the structure now shows you, when we go in hindsight and we look, we say, it must have been so. So you can mark PBM here because it's an increase of knowledge on this issue here. But just as we have up here a hard way mark, the hard way mark here is the loud cry.
Okay.
So, I don't know how long I've been.
It'll be an hour and 15.
Oh, no one told me to stop, sorry. No, they should do, my watch doesn't work. Let's have a break, and we'll try and answer Sister Sophie's question in the next class. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We ask and pray for a blessing. Lord, help each of us to have our questions and the desires of our hearts answered during this special convocation that we're here together. Please be with us and bless us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.